In our everyday language, we often use the word stupid, casually, dismissively, even cruelly. We label a mistake as stupid. We call someone stupid when they fail to understand something we think is obvious. But what if stupidity is not simply a lack of intelligence? What if stupidity is far more complex, more social, more moral, and more psychologically dangerous than we've ever imagined? Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German theologian imprisoned and eventually executed by the Nazi regime, observed something terrifying during his final years. He noticed that some of the greatest atrocities were not carried out by raging fanatics or deliberate villains, but by ordinary people. People who might have seemed kind, polite, even intelligent in daily life. People who, when embedded within a system of power, appeared to lose the ability, or perhaps the will, to think critically. For Bonhoeffer, this led to a sobering realization: stupidity is not an intellectual defect. It is a human condition rooted in moral failure. Modern psychology supports this unsettling view. In fact, research consistently shows that intelligence, measured in IQ points, does not necessarily protect a person from believing or doing stupid things. You could have a genius working in a lab who also believes in a flat earth. You could meet someone with a PhD who blindly follows propaganda. Why? Because stupidity, in the way Bonhoeffer described it, is not about what you know, it's about how you think, or more precisely, how you don't. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman introduced a helpful framework, the dual system model of the brain. System 1 is fast, instinctive, and emotional. System 2 is slow, deliberate, and rational. Most of our decisions are driven by System 1. It's efficient, but also deeply vulnerable to error. When we rely on snap judgments, gut feelings, or social cues rather than reflection and analysis, we open the door for stupidity to enter, not because we're incapable of thinking, but because we choose not to. And this is where the danger lies. Bonhoeffer didn't see stupidity as a passive state. He saw it as an active resistance to reason. A person may have the tools to think but refuses to use them when truth becomes inconvenient. Stupidity isn't just about being wrong, it's about becoming incapable of recognizing right. Ask yourself this: have you ever clung to an idea, not because it made the most sense, but because it felt safe? Or because your friends believed it? Or because it was easier than confronting the alternative? That right there is the psychological shadow of stupidity. It's not that you couldn't see another perspective. It's that you didn't want to. And in that unwillingness, in that unconscious protection of our ego or comfort, we let go of our responsibility to think. Cognitive dissonance plays a powerful role here. When faced with information that contradicts our beliefs, we feel discomfort. To reduce that discomfort, we often distort facts, dismiss evidence, or attack the messenger. These aren't signs of low intelligence. They're signs of psychological defense mechanisms at work. Stupidity then becomes a shield, a way to protect ourselves from uncomfortable truths, no matter the cost. Bonhoeffer's insight helps us name what we so often feel but struggle to articulate: that stupidity isn't merely irritating, it's insidious. It masquerades as confidence. It hides behind ideology. And worst of all, it spreads. Because when people stop thinking for themselves, when they surrender their capacity for reflection, they become tools. Not actors, but instruments. And that is what makes stupidity, as Bonhoeffer wrote, more dangerous than evil. But if stupidity isn't just ignorance, and it isn't just low intelligence, then what is it exactly? Is it a choice? A habit? A learned behavior? Or something that lives in the tension between our psychology and the world around us? The answer may not be simple, but the question is urgent. In your own life, in your own mind, are you thinking clearly, or just reacting? Are you examining your beliefs, or repeating what you've heard? Are you seeing reality, or choosing a version of it that feels more comfortable? The psychology of stupidity is not a distant academic topic. It is personal. It is alive. And it is dangerously easy to fall into, especially when we believe we never could. To understand the psychology of stupidity, we must look beyond the individual and into the collective. It is in groups, in institutions, and within the momentum of social forces that stupidity becomes truly powerful. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in developing his theory of stupidity, warned that stupidity is not a private flaw but a social phenomenon. It does not simply thrive in isolation. It spreads in communities, in political movements, in fanatical crowds. And most dangerously, it feeds off power. Social psychology reveals that individual critical thinking often collapses under the pressure of collective identity. The more we align ourselves with a group, the more likely we are to suppress personal reasoning in favor of group beliefs. This tendency is not limited to any one class, ideology, or intelligence level. It is a feature of human behavior itself. When people feel safer identifying with a collective narrative, they become more willing to silence doubt and outsource thinking. One of the most dangerous expressions of this dynamic is groupthink. In environments where dissent is discouraged and consensus is rewarded, people stop thinking analytically. Instead, they conform to avoid conflict, even when the direction of the group is clearly flawed or destructive. In these moments, stupidity becomes contagious. The collective shields the individual from responsibility, and within that safety, truth becomes irrelevant. The psychology of stupidity finds fertile ground in conformity. When faced with the choice between truth and belonging, many people unconsciously choose belonging. Propaganda, political rhetoric, and social media influence all capitalize on this vulnerability. These tools do not merely spread ideas. They manufacture consensus. And when consensus is built not on reflection, but on repetition, stupidity becomes institutionalized. Ask yourself this: when was the last time you questioned the beliefs held by your own group? Have you ever noticed how difficult it feels to challenge a popular opinion, especially when your peers stand behind it? That discomfort, that hesitation to question, is the pressure that shapes the social psychology of stupidity. Bonhoeffer observed that once a person becomes part of a system driven by collective power, they often lose the capacity to reason independently. In his theory of stupidity, he emphasized that stupidity is not simply a personal failure. It is a surrender, a giving up of thought, a trading of moral and intellectual agency for a sense of unity, purpose, or even safety. This surrender, though often unconscious, is what enables evil to operate behind the scenes of ordinary life. From a psychological perspective, this surrender can be explained through cognitive biases. The bandwagon effect, for instance, describes how people tend to adopt beliefs because others around them believe the same. Emotional reasoning replaces evidence with feelings. We begin to assume something is true simply because it feels true or because it is emotionally satisfying to believe. This is how irrationality creeps in, disguised as intuition or moral certainty. What makes the psychology of stupidity so alarming is that it does not always feel stupid. In fact, it often feels righteous. That is why so many dangerous ideologies can flourish in times of fear, division, and unrest. People do not always follow lies because they are deceived. Sometimes they follow because the lie gives them a sense of identity. This raises a deeply personal question. In your day-to-day life, whose voice is guiding your thoughts? When you read the news, join a conversation, or take a position, is your thinking truly your own? Or has it become shaped by invisible social forces that you have not yet questioned? Understanding the theory of stupidity is not just an academic pursuit. It is a mirror. a reflection of how easily our minds can be molded by forces larger than ourselves. And unless we remain vigilant, we may find that our silence, our passivity, and our desire to belong have made us instruments of ideas we do not fully understand. This is the social nature of stupidity. Not loud, not obvious, but quietly dangerous. And unless it is recognized, questioned, and resisted, it will continue to grow, not as an individual flaw, but as a social epidemic. In many stories, evil is obvious. It wears a villain's mask, speaks in threats, and plans destruction with deliberate intent. But in real life, evil often appears mundane, ordinary, even dull. The people who carry out the worst actions are not always monsters. Sometimes they are your neighbors, your co-workers, your teachers. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in developing his theory of stupidity, recognized this unsettling reality. He concluded that stupidity is more dangerous than evil because, unlike evil, stupidity cannot be reasoned with, argued against, or even meaningfully confronted. To grasp this fully, we must revisit the psychology of stupidity. At its core, stupidity does not just reject knowledge. It disables the very process of thinking. A stupid person, in Bonhoeffer's terms, is not merely wrong. They are unreachable. No logical argument penetrates, no evidence matters, and no appeal to empathy works. This creates a dangerous psychological condition in which people lose both their moral compass and their capacity to reflect on their own actions. From a philosophical standpoint, evil often still requires awareness. A person committing evil may know what they are doing and may weigh the consequences. But stupidity requires no such reflection. It simply follows. It adopts opinions from the outside and acts on them without question. It spreads lies as if they were facts, and it silences truth with the confidence of ignorance. This is where the danger lies. A person driven by stupidity does not stop to ask whether what they believe is true. They do not ask whether their actions are just. They merely repeat what they have heard, join what feels familiar, and conform to what feels right. When millions of people act this way, evil does not need to persuade. It simply needs to be accepted. And stupidity makes that acceptance easy. This phenomenon has been examined in social psychology through the lens of moral disengagement. When individuals stop seeing themselves as morally responsible for their actions, especially when those actions are framed as part of a larger system, they begin to act in ways that would horrify them under normal conditions. The psychology of stupidity accelerates this process because it removes the tools that would normally challenge behavior, reflection, empathy, and doubt. The Dunning-Kruger effect is another layer of this problem. It describes how people with the least knowledge or skill are often the most confident in their beliefs. This cognitive bias is central to the psychology of stupidity. People who lack expertise are often unaware of their limitations, which makes them more likely to assert false beliefs with unwavering certainty. When combined with emotional reasoning and ideological loyalty, this creates a closed psychological loop that is almost impossible to break from the outside. Ask yourself this: have you ever met someone who was completely sure of themselves, even when they were wrong? Someone who dismissed facts, ignored logic, and clung to ideas no matter how irrational they were? Have you ever been that person? These moments are not just frustrating. They are dangerous. In a world increasingly shaped by algorithms, echo chambers, and ideological division, stupidity is not just a mistake. It is a weapon. It can be used to spread false beliefs, incite violence, and erode truth. And it often does so in the name of justice, tradition, or freedom. The theory of stupidity, as Bonhoeffer presented it, challenges us to rethink who we fear. The truly dangerous person may not be the one plotting harm, but the one who no longer thinks for themselves. Because that person can be used, by systems, by ideologies, by power, without ever knowing it. The psychology of stupidity warns us that ignorance is no longer just a private flaw. It has become a tool of destruction. And unless we learn to recognize its symptoms, we will continue to underestimate the threat it poses to society, to truth, and to each of us individually. The psychology of stupidity reaches its most devastating form when it strips individuals of their sense of responsibility. What makes stupidity so insidious is not just that it blinds people to truth, but that it convinces them they are no longer accountable for their thoughts, choices, or actions. When a person succumbs to this state, they become a vessel for the will of others, political leaders, social movements, algorithms, or crowds, without realizing that they have forfeited their autonomy. In the heart of his theory of stupidity, Dietrich Bonhoeffer observed that stupid individuals are not free. He wrote that stupidity is not an intellectual failing, but a surrender of moral independence. A person who no longer questions what they are told has relinquished their ability to choose rightly. And when responsibility is surrendered, evil can act without resistance. In that moment, the machinery of destruction does not require monsters. It only requires silence, compliance, and passivity. Modern psychology offers insight into this dangerous psychological mechanism. The concept of diffusion of responsibility, often studied in social and behavioral research, explains how people in groups tend to feel less personally accountable for the outcome of collective actions. When everyone is responsible, no one feels responsible. This cognitive shift allows ordinary individuals to participate in harmful systems, whether in politics, corporations, or social media, without feeling guilt or shame. In the presence of stupidity, this effect becomes even more pronounced, because self-reflection is no longer part of the internal process. Ask yourself honestly, have you ever gone along with something simply because it was easier than questioning it? Have you ever stayed quiet in the face of something wrong because the cost of speaking up felt too high? In these moments, the psychology of stupidity is not abstract. It becomes deeply personal. Bonhoeffer's reflections did not emerge in theory alone. He wrote them while imprisoned by the Nazi regime, watching how an entire society had become complicit in atrocities. Many of those complicit were not evil in the traditional sense. They were obedient, ordinary, respectable. But they had stopped thinking. They had stopped examining their role in the system. And in doing so, they had stopped being responsible. This is where the theory of stupidity takes on a chilling weight. When a person surrenders responsibility, they also surrender their moral power. They are no longer able to assess whether their contribution to a system is ethical or not. They defer that judgment to leaders, to slogans, or to popular opinion. This form of self-deception is not always conscious. It often feels like virtue, loyalty, unity, patriotism, but in truth, it is the erosion of the individual conscience. The psychology of stupidity also intersects with emotional reasoning. Instead of thinking through a problem, individuals react emotionally and justify their behavior afterward. This psychological pattern reduces the complexity of moral decision-making to simplistic emotional triggers. When combined with ignorance and the desire to belong, emotional reasoning allows people to believe they are doing good, even when their actions support oppression, discrimination, or manipulation. Moreover, the increasing influence of propaganda in modern communication environments has shown how easy it is to manufacture mass compliance. By appealing to identity, fear, and outrage, those in power can bypass logic and appeal directly to tribal instincts. Once this happens, critical thinking becomes irrelevant. Stupidity becomes systemic. And moral disengagement becomes normalized. In today's world, where misinformation, cognitive bias, and political tribalism dominate public discourse, the responsibility to think has never been more urgent. The psychology of stupidity is not just about other people. It is about all of us. Each one of us must ask, are we willing to examine our beliefs, or are we choosing the comfort of consensus? Are we owning our choices, or are we letting systems decide for us? The theory of stupidity shows us that responsibility is not something that can be delegated. It is the defining feature of moral adulthood. Without it, even the brightest mind can become dangerous. And without it, the cost of stupidity will always be paid by the innocent. At first glance, it seems logical to assume that more intelligence would mean less stupidity. We are taught from childhood that smart people solve problems, avoid mistakes, and make better decisions. But the psychology of stupidity complicates this belief. Intelligence in itself is not a cure. In fact, it can sometimes mask stupidity, even reinforce it. Dietrich Bonhoeffer's theory of stupidity never equated intellectual brilliance with moral clarity. His writings suggest that some of the most dangerous forms of stupidity are practiced by people who appear highly educated, articulate, and confident. In modern psychological research, intelligence is often measured by IQ, problem-solving skills, or abstract reasoning. However, these qualities do not automatically lead to wise thinking. Intelligence can make someone better at rationalizing, better at defending poor choices, and better at constructing arguments to support harmful beliefs. Without humility, without moral self-awareness, intelligence becomes a tool, not for truth, but for self-deception. This is why so many intelligent people fall prey to cognitive bias, emotional reasoning, and confirmation bias. These psychological distortions affect all of us, regardless of intellect. A smart person might believe that their reasoning is immune to error, which actually makes them more vulnerable to irrationality. When someone believes they are too smart to be wrong, they often stop listening. And when they stop listening, they stop learning. Consider the Dunning-Kruger effect once again. It does not only apply to the ignorant. It can also affect the intelligent when they overestimate their knowledge in areas outside their expertise. Confidence, especially when not grounded in critical reflection, becomes a dangerous illusion. And in the context of the psychology of stupidity, that illusion becomes a doorway through which false beliefs, groupthink, and moral blindness can easily enter. Ask yourself, have you ever dismissed someone's perspective simply because you believed you were more informed? Have you ever felt so sure about your knowledge that you no longer questioned its origin? These moments reveal how intelligence, unaccompanied by humility, can lead to intellectual arrogance. And arrogance, no matter how eloquent, can still be deeply stupid. This truth also applies at the societal level. Many institutions that pride themselves on intellectual authority, academia, government, media, are not immune to the effects of collective stupidity. When institutions reward conformity over curiosity, or status over truth, intelligence becomes weaponized. It is used not to uncover reality, but to defend ideologies, reputations, and structures of power. Bonhoeffer's theory of stupidity reminds us that intelligence without moral responsibility is not only insufficient, it can be fatal. Another psychological pitfall is motivated reasoning, the tendency to interpret evidence in a way that confirms what we already believe. Intelligent people often excel at motivated reasoning. They know how to cherry-pick data, construct sophisticated arguments, and appear reasonable even when their conclusions are biased. This ability to rationalize gives stupidity a polished exterior, which makes it harder to detect and even harder to challenge. So can intelligence prevent stupidity? The answer is no, not by itself. It can help, but only when paired with self-awareness, critical thinking, and the courage to be wrong. Intelligence must serve wisdom, not ego. It must be guided by a desire to seek truth, not just to win arguments or defend personal pride. The psychology of stupidity teaches us that the real danger lies not in how smart a person is, but in how they use, or refuse to use, that intelligence. Intelligence without introspection leads to deception. Intelligence without empathy leads to cruelty. Intelligence without doubt leads to extremism. Bonhoeffer's warning is still relevant today. Stupidity is not a lack of brains. It is a lack of moral and psychological courage. And unless we teach ourselves to question, to pause, to reflect, and to admit error, intelligence will not save us. In fact, it may only disguise the very stupidity we claim to avoid. If stupidity is more than ignorance, if it is a condition of the mind shaped by fear, power, conformity, and self-deception, then we must ask a pressing question: can it be cured? Can someone trapped in the psychology of stupidity find their way out? Or does the condition deepen with time, feeding off silence and social reinforcement until it becomes irreversible? Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in the heart of his theory of stupidity, warned that stupidity cannot be overcome by instruction alone. He wrote that facts and reasoning fall on deaf ears when a person has relinquished their ability to think independently. The stupid person, he said, is often unaware of their condition and therefore resists attempts at correction. In his view, the only hope lies in a deeper transformation, a liberation of the person from the forces that have made them mentally passive. This liberation is not easy. The psychology of stupidity functions like a psychological virus. It replicates in environments where people stop questioning, where responsibility is outsourced, and where emotional reasoning replaces critical thinking. To escape this trap, individuals must first become aware of their own vulnerability. They must realize that stupidity is not something that happens to others. It is something that can quietly grow inside anyone who lets their guard down. One of the most important tools for resisting stupidity is metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking. By reflecting on how we form beliefs, how we react emotionally, and how we respond to disagreement, we begin to detect the patterns of irrationality that so often slip past unnoticed. Metacognition allows us to step back from the automatic habits of mind and see our thought process for what it truly is: a series of choices, biases, and assumptions that require conscious evaluation. Psychologists also point to the value of cognitive humility, the recognition that we do not know everything and never will. People who practice cognitive humility are more open to new information, more willing to revise their beliefs, and less threatened by disagreement. This quality is essential for breaking the psychological rigidity that defines the psychology of stupidity. When we accept that we might be wrong, we give ourselves permission to grow. But reflection alone is not enough. Action must follow awareness. Bonhoeffer believed that stupidity could only be defeated through an act of liberation. In today's terms, this liberation involves removing oneself from echo chambers, resisting ideological loyalty, and stepping outside environments that reward obedience over truth. It means choosing to think even when thinking is hard. It means speaking even when silence feels safer. Ask yourself directly, in what areas of your life have you stopped questioning? Are there beliefs you hold that have never been examined? Are there systems you support that you have never truly challenged? The psychology of stupidity depends on these blind spots. It depends on your comfort. It thrives in the spaces where you are unwilling to be uncomfortable. There is also a spiritual dimension to this transformation. The philosopher Carl Jung spoke often of the shadow, the unconscious part of ourselves that we deny or ignore. Within that shadow live our prejudices, our irrational fears, and our hidden desires for control or safety. To overcome stupidity, we must confront that shadow. We must face the parts of ourselves that prefer ignorance because truth feels dangerous. This process is painful, but it is also redemptive. It leads us out of the psychological prison of stupidity and into a place of responsibility, clarity, and freedom. It does not require brilliance. It requires honesty. It does not demand perfection. It demands presence. The theory of stupidity, if understood deeply, is not just a critique of society. It is a map. A map showing where we go wrong, and how we might return to ourselves. It asks us not just to notice stupidity in others, but to root it out in ourselves. And it gives us a warning that we cannot ignore. The cure is not comfort. The cure is the courage to think, to feel, and to change. The psychology of stupidity loses its power the moment we stop running from truth. In that moment, the mind awakens. And a free mind is the only true defense against the quiet violence of stupidity. Throughout this journey into the psychology of stupidity, we have uncovered a truth that is both uncomfortable and vital. Stupidity is not merely a defect of intellect. It is a failure of engagement, a disconnection from self-awareness, and a withdrawal from responsibility. It is not loud, but it is persistent. Not flashy, but deeply destructive. And unlike evil, which often reveals itself, stupidity hides in plain sight, inside systems, inside culture, and inside you. Bonhoeffer's theory of stupidity leaves us with more than just a warning. It leaves us with a challenge. Will you live your life blindly absorbing the thoughts of others, or will you take ownership of your mind? Will you be a mouthpiece for the herd, or will you dare to question what others are afraid to see? The psychology of stupidity teaches us that the real threat is not always the tyrant or the liar. Often, it is the passive citizen, the agreeable follower, the person who believes they are safe because they have chosen comfort over truth. This person may seem harmless, but their inaction paves the road for harm. This is why stupidity, in its psychological form, is more dangerous than evil. Evil knows what it wants. It plots, it hides, it manipulates. But stupidity does not even know what it is serving. It lacks self-awareness. It acts without thinking. And in doing so, it becomes the perfect tool for destruction. But if stupidity can be weaponized, then so can its opposite. A free mind is a dangerous mind. Dangerous not because it causes harm, but because it resists being controlled. It refuses propaganda. It rejects shallow certainty. It asks uncomfortable questions. It holds itself accountable even when others do not. Ask yourself now, at the end of this reflection, in what ways are you dangerous? Do your thoughts disturb complacency? Does your voice break through the noise of conformity? Or have you, without even realizing it, been softened by convenience, paralyzed by fear, and numbed by the comfort of collective illusion? The theory of stupidity calls each of us to vigilance. The real revolution is not on the outside. It begins in how you choose to think, how you choose to speak, and how you choose to show up when the crowd has already made up its mind. It begins with humility, but it ends in strength. A kind of strength that is not loud, not cruel, but immovable in its integrity. The psychology of stupidity will always be with us, because it lives where thought is absent and reflection is avoided. But it loses its power the moment you awaken. The moment you look at your thoughts and ask, "Are these truly mine?" The moment you stop letting the crowd define your convictions. That is when stupidity ends. And that is when something far more powerful begins. So be dangerous. Be dangerous in the way that only clarity can be. Be dangerous in the way that truth demands. Because the world does not need more brilliance. It needs more honesty. It needs more courage. And it needs more minds that have chosen to be awake.